Hi guys, I am just going to do a quick explanation of the first two chapters of The Theory of Morality by Donagan. So, I'm taking a ethics class this semester. I am a philosophy student and I am taking an ethics class, and I really want to try to make sense of this because this is how I study, explaining things to people. But no one really wants to listen to me ramble about philosophy, so I'm putting it on YouTube. Or maybe not. We'll see. I'm gonna put on some music. Background helps me. I have a little paper pad in case I need to draw something. Okay. So I can test on this and just figure out what I mean. So there's a couple things in the first two chapters that I would like to point out off the hop, and then I'll go kind of page by page. So the first thing is that Donagan wants to draw, and this is the first chapter. Too loud. He wants to draw from Judeo-Christian morality beliefs, but he argues that you don't necessarily need a lawmaker, aka God, in that Christian sense, and that you can have those foundational morals without God. But he doesn't necessarily deny God, but he says with or without a lawmaker, you can have these foundational morals. And he goes over Hegel's idea that this is the first chapter, that morality changes over time. So something that is not morally permissible like 100 years ago could be morally permissible today, and that the ultimate end is that there will be absolute truth. So we're kind of moving in the right direction, and although Donagan rejects this and comes up kind of with his own theory, it's very interesting the part where he talks about, what is his name? Uh, Jager's, I can't pronounce his name. Let's just call him Jager. Person that I, anyway, let's call him Jager. It's on page 17. But it's very interesting. So, Donagan outlines the Catholic Doctrine, and his name's Franz Jager something, and he was a Catholic, and in the Catholic belief, it says when rulers have declared war against other countries, they usually have not broken into their lands in order to improve them or perhaps give them something. Thus, if one is fighting against the Russian people, he will also take as much out of the country as can be put to use here. And he kind of goes on, and he's questioning the idea of war and going to war. So he was being drafted for what we now know as the Nazi War, but at the time he didn't think that it was a valid war to fight, so he didn't want to go. And in the Catholic belief, um, you're not supposed to go to war if it's not a valid war. Now, as Donagan mentions, this is kind of debatable considering the Catholics' own history of starting wars and whether or not those wars were ethically grounded in their reasoning for starting the war. But he kind of moves away from that, and this Jager guy is consulting his priest because he believes that there's no reason to go to this war because he doesn't think that it's ethical. And he refused, but the bishop and someone else in the church that the priest and the bishop, he consulted, and they just kind of said go along with the times. Like, this is like, you're being drafted, go get drafted. Like, just don't fight. The punishment to not go is death. And, everyone else is doing it. It must be fine. So then he countered, for what purpose did God endow all men with reason and free will, Psalm 16, if, despite this, we have to render blind obedience, or if, as many also say, the individual is not qualified to judge whether this war started by Germany is just or unjust? What purpose served by the ability to distinguish between good and evil? So he's basically saying, why did God give us free will and the reason to choose between good and evil if we're not encouraged to do so, especially by the church? And he just didn't believe it was an ethical war, so he didn't go to war. And he got executed for that. So, in Hegel's view, that would mean that morality is changing over time. So, at the time, it was bad for him not to go to war because the moral thing to do at the time was believed to be drafted, which is why the punishment was death. But he didn't feel like it was morally okay. And this is an argument almost towards permissible permanence, so that there's these foundational morals, which Donagan is going to be arguing from a very Kantian belief that there's these universal ideas or morals, and Donagan calls them principles or precepts later in chapter 2. These universal maxims, as Kant called them, where they're the foundation. So, like, do not murder, for example, would be true, it's universal, true to everyone, and you can only exercise it, at least in Kant's view, if you're willing to make it a universal maxim. So, for example, if you are stealing from people all the time, and you don't want to be stolen from, then you can't make it a universal maxim you can't steal if you don't want to be stolen from. Now, the problem with Kant is he believed in self-legislation, so kind of setting these moral maxims for yourself, and if you wouldn't do it, then don't expect other people to, for example. So if you want to steal, you have to just accept that people are going to steal from you, and there's a lot of issues with that, but that's a whole nother thing. But Donagan kind of wants to go off on that and use this Judeo-Christian idea that they have these foundational morals, like the Ten Commandments, for example, where it's like, thou shalt not kill, all these things. He believes those are foundational morals, and the fact that these morals have been considered in theology over thousands of years, he thinks is a valid place to start because they have been looked over so much. So there's a lot of headway already with them. Now let me just see if there's anything here that I wanted to point out that I underlined. And this is interesting. Okay, this is page 2. So he's talking about the idea of nature. So he goes on later in chapter 2 to say two of his ideas is that humans are rational animals, and with the rational part we have reason, obviously, and thinking logically, and then with the animal part of that we have our desires and our needs, our primitive desires. And the second thing that he puts forward in the second chapter is that nature is morally neutral. So he begins kind of by talking here on page 2 talking about nature. So the idea that even before there was God, it's almost like a preconceived notion of this idea of rational behavior. And he attacks, I can never say her name right, Anscombe, who wrote, gosh, was it called? The Theory of Moral philosophy, I believe, was the title of her essay. It was one of the most read essays on moral philosophy, and she basically said we need to go back to Aristotle's ethics, and that's looking at the basis defining certain words. So she says, how can we say that something is just when we don't understand the word justice? So that was what Aristotle was kind of calling for, these individual definitions of words which he believed were universal. So in virtue ethics, Anscombe is calling to go back to that, because she's saying that in the past we had a lawmaker, which is God, um, write the Bible. So you have, or whatever religion, but let's just use the Bible for example, because they are talking a lot about Judeo-Christian beliefs. So you have this God that writes the Bible, you have these beliefs, and this lawmaker has created this scale almost. So you know what you're expected to do. Thou shalt not kill, for example. So if you kill, you know you've done something wrong. So it's a way to measure it, and you have the accountability from this lawmaker and a purpose to do something or not to do it from a moral perspective. And Anscombe is saying that in modern day, which she's in the 20th century, so I think people reject religion even more today, but she was saying that, and it's interesting because she was actually a believer, but she was saying that we need to go back and figure out, now that in modern day people don't believe as much in God and there's not a consistent religion, so this idea of a lawmaker with all these different conflicting religions, or just with the rise of atheism and everything, you have to admit that without this lawmaker, you're not, like, what are you gonna do? Like, if people don't believe in God, and they don't read the Bible, and they don't, where are these morals coming from? Like, Kant would say, you have to do something for the sake of just doing it, right? Because it's for the good of humanity. I guess that's kind of more unitary, or I always want to call it Unitarianism, but I know it is utilitarianism. So sad. Anyway, so there's two beliefs. One, utilitarianism. So this is one of the things Donagan rejects, is utilitarianism. Because he says that utilitarianism says that you need to do whatever you're doing for the ultimate good. That's the ultimate good. But then, Anscombe's rejection of that is you can make anything morally permissible. So if killing an innocent person would save the community, for example, like in Nazi Germany, to go back to this Jagger guy, if killing the Jews would create a stronger community bond, because you're giving a scapegoat to the problem. So it's like, oh, here's the problem, it must be the Jewish people. If we kill them off, then everything's good. But obviously, that didn't happen. But having the idea of kind of a scapegoat, if that was predicted to be the best for society, then that's what you want. There's the peeping Tom example with utilitarianism, and that it's permissible to be a peeping Tom and be looking in some poor woman's window and having some fun. If she doesn't know, because you're increasing your own pleasure and you're not decreasing her husband's pleasure because they're not aware of it. So for a utilitarian, that's ideal. But Anscombe was saying, well, the problem is with that is you can justify all these horrible acts as long as they help the overall population. So, not ideal. The other view that Donagan rejects is ontology, which, he doesn't reject as completely as he does with utilitarianism, but that's more Kant's idea, that you should just follow these moral maxims because they're moral maxims, and because it'll help society. You're human, you should respect other humans, period. It's best for us. We gotta do that. But back to Anscombe, he says, Donagan, that her inference was also, this is page 3, it was mistaken that if those who deny the existence of a divine lawgiver choose to discuss ethical topics, they should follow Aristotle's example and do it by a way of the theory of the virtues. Concept of morality as virtue is not an alternative to the conception of it as law. Taking virtue in the Aristotelian way to be a disposition having to do with choice, consisting in a mean determined by a rational principle, namely the principle by which a man of practical wisdom would determine it, the conception of morality as virtue presupposes that in situations calling for moral choice, practical wisdom can determine whether or not a given choice accords with a rationally determined mean. With respect to the virtue of justice, Anscombe herself declares that in normal circumstances, it is unjust to deprive people of their property without legal procedure, not to pay debts, blah blah blah. The inference is irresistible that each precept of moral virtue of the form in normal circumstances to act in such and such a way would be unjust or contrary to some other specific virtue such as courage or temperance. There is a precept of moral law that its counterpart, namely, in normal circumstances to act in such and such a way, would be morally wrong. And if the former can be arrived at by natural human reasoning, the latter can too. So,